Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in good spirits wherever you are in the world. And please continue to stay safe and stay strong during these times. And I'd like to use this opportunity to address another question or set of questions that I was very fortunate to have been able to receive on the Q&A video that I posted back in April 2020, where I asked for questions if you were interested in hearing my responses. And I received another set of questions, and so I'd like to take this opportunity to present another Q&A video. This time, by my count, this is Q&A part 15. So I am at the video, which is called Please Ask Me Your Questions for a Future Q&A, April 23, 2020. And I've gone through the questions in past Q&A videos, so thank you so much again for those of you who posted questions and expressed an interest in my background and who I am and what it is I have to say. I'm very flattered and very honored. And the recent set of questions that I received is from a viewer called AKAJK. So hello and thank you very much for your 3 questions here. And you say, "Hi Daisuke, I'm unsure if you've had a Kubrick question on one of the Q&As yet, but regardless, Stanley Kubrick is easily my favorite filmmaker of all time. I'm not going to ask you to rank his films in case you have a video planned for them, but I'd like to know your thoughts on him. Also, in terms of filmmakers today, who would you consider the best filmmaker alive? My pick is Martin Scorsese, and who's your favorite up-and-coming filmmaker? I can't really decide. A lot of names come to mind. Thanks, Daisuke." Wow, well, thank you very much for these wonderful questions, this wonderful set of questions. I'm really very happy to receive them. And so you have 3 questions here. So if you don't mind, maybe I can go in reverse order. So I can address your last question first, and then we'll go from there. So your last question, your 3rd question is, who is your favorite up-and-coming filmmaker? Now, this is a very interesting question. I'm so glad you asked it. Now, as I should say, I've said it many times, I'm not the most keenly aware of the most recent cinema trends because I don't go to the movie theater. I don't watch recent films as much as I should. So I'm very behind the times when it comes to the most recent stuff. And also my conception of recent tends to be more in maybe the last 10 or 15 years or so, maybe a little bit more. So it might be a little bit broader or a little bit wider in time than other people's conception of the meaning of recent or up and coming. So maybe my answer might not necessarily be satisfactory to you, so I apologize in advance. But perhaps if I could mention one filmmaker, it would be the filmmaker from Japan, whose name is Naoko Ogigami. And I'll mention her name in the description box below, just in case you're interested. Naoko Ogigami. And she has a really interesting career as a filmmaker, as a film director up to now. And so she already has a very good filmography. And so it's worth checking out if you're able to see some of her films. Her voice is very clever. It is very calming. She has a certain calming, almost transcendental look at the world that still has a great focus on not just the environments, but also on people and choices made by people. especially vis-a-vis the context of modern living, modern city living. Sometimes in the context of modern Japanese city living, but other times it doesn't have to be in Japan. It can be in other places around the world. And so that's what I find very fascinating about her works. They are very localized and centralized on the one hand, because she is a Japanese filmmaker with certain concerns with respect to Japanese society writ large. But also, I think her concerns are also universal. And she has many insights about language, about communication, and about how that forms many parts of our own identities, and many other deeply concerning, very thoughtful approaches to cinematic storytelling are contained within her works. I could mention as examples films like Close-Knit. Close-Knit is a really wonderful example of her keen sense of character, especially in the context of modern day Japan. And then another great one of my favorites actually, is called Kamome Diner, or Seagull Diner. And if you can get that, if you haven't seen it already, then I think you're in for a real treat. That is a wonderfully brilliant, funny, fresh, very charmingly quirky drama that does so many things at once, and it's still so calming and reassuring and reaffirming in so many ways. So there's Naoko Ogigami. And once again, let me mention a great friend and a great channel, Luke at Razor Wire Reviews. He's really championed Naoko Ogigami very much, and so I really take to his example of championing her works very, very well. And so thank you very much to Luke at Razor Wire Reviews. And in fact, I was able to make a few videos about Naoko Ogigami's work, which appear on Luke's channel, Razor Wire Reviews. So in case you're interested, if you want to check those out, I'd be very honored. So my thanks once again to Luke at Razor Wire Reviews. And once again, the filmmaker is Naoko Ogigami. Maybe it doesn't necessarily fit the specific definition of up and coming, because as I say, her career is already well established. Very, very well established, not just in Japan, but also in the world festival circuit, for example. But I suppose I mention her in the context of your question now, because maybe that's my way of saying that I hope to see more films from her, as many films from her as possible in the future. So anyway, that is the filmmaker Naoko Ogigami. Your next question is, also in terms of filmmakers today, who would you consider the best filmmaker alive? My pick is Martin Scorsese. And I think this is a very good question, and I echo your sentiments with respect to Martin Scorsese in answering this question. I think his career it speaks for itself. I mean, you don't need me to add anything further to that conversation, which is already very much alive and present in film fan circles across the globe, which is that his work is singularly excellent. It is really quite excellent, and it's amazing to see the trajectory and consistency of his career throughout the years, throughout the decades, ever since his early work that really blossomed and really took the world by storm in the 70s, and then on through the 80s, and his concerns that grew into the 90s and beyond, and now, of course, with his most recent works and cinematic efforts. So I echo your sentiments about Martin Scorsese very much. So there's that. Perhaps another filmmaker I could add to the equation or to the conversation. And again, I'm just going to mention another name. I could go on and on and on about this, but just for purposes of this Q&A video, let me mention one other name, which is David Lynch. I think that David Lynch's work is singularly unique. I am a huge fan of Lynch's work. I always have been, and I always will be. His work never fails to surprise me, never fails to please me. It scares me, it frightens me, it puts me on edge. It makes me wonder and be curious and ask questions and really add further mystery upon mystery upon mystery. What the heck is going on with some of this stuff? But that's the point, really. And that feeling of unease and not being sure, that's part of the beauty of watching a Lynch work. I have not yet spoken with as much detail as I would like on this channel with respect to Lynch's works, but please know that I am a huge, huge, huge admirer of his works. I have been since I was a little boy, and up to now. I've had the great pleasure and honor of witnessing his works, some of them in the theater in particular, and they've been so just unforgettable film viewing experiences in many respects. And so I think David Lynch, anything he does, he's at the point in his career where anything he does, I think he's always been like this, but just anything he does is just so filled with wonder and beauty and awe. And comedy and horror and a whole mix of concerns and a way of looking at the world and life and people. That is just a sight to behold, absolute sight to behold. One of these, I can go on and on about his works, of course, but one of my great dream projects, I would love the opportunity to go through, for example, all of his works. I'd love the opportunity to go through all of his works one of these days on this channel. But in particular, there are so many films that I love by him. But I don't know if you know Dumbland. I think that is such a unique and a brilliant take on sort of rage and anger management in the context of rural life, and then also a really great, very clever use of animation and sound, etc. But that's just one example of something I'd love to do. I'd love to be able to talk about all of Dumbland. But anyway, that's just one part of what I'd love to do one day on this channel, which is go through the works of David Lynch and just really try to explore them. I don't think I'd be able to answer all the questions. That I don't think I'd be able at all to add anything of substance to the conversation, because so many more people have been talking about Lynch for years, much more than I'd be able to even hope to be able to do so. So my comments on his works wouldn't be at all of any great importance at all, but just to be able to speak about them and to share my excitement about them, I think would be a great opportunity. So one of these days, perhaps on this channel, I'd love to talk about the works of David Lynch. And then your first question is, Stanley Kubrick is easily my favorite filmmaker of all time. I'm not going to ask you to rank his films in case you have a video planned for them, but I'd like to know your thoughts on him. Okay, so this is another filmmaker that I haven't spoken about in as much detail as I would like. This is the works of Stanley Kubrick, and there are a number of reasons for this. First is, I too am a huge, huge admirer of the works of Stanley Kubrick. I have grown up watching his works, and I still remember the great excitement that was in the air when whenever his works would be spoken about in classes or amongst friends, etc. And it was a real every Stanley Kubrick film in its own way is its own special treat, and it has its own special world of cinema. And I'm a great admirer of his works. And I'm also very much aware that I would never be able to add anything at all to the discussion of Stanley Kubrick's films. And so I've always been a little bit, I've been aware of my inability to be able to address his works to the extent that I would be able to, or to the extent that I would like to, because I don't have that ability. But still, I have a great, great, great admiration for his works and his contributions to cinema, which is just unparalleled in many respects. For example, I'll just give you a few examples. I always consider his films to grow. There's an amazing thing how they continue to grow and they evolve in my own personal film journey. And I can say, for example, I'll give you a few examples. Eyes Wide Shut. So Eyes Wide Shut, I remember when that was first released, and it was, of course, a very big deal for a number of reasons. Of course, the timing, of course, with respect to the unfortunate passing of Stanley Kubrick, but also that it was a first film in many, many years since Full Metal Jacket, in terms of a full feature film that was given a theatrical release. And there was a lot of fanfare, a lot of publicity with respect to the performers, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, etc. And I remember watching that film when I was, whatever I was, in my early 20s or something, very, very young, younger than I am now. And I remember my reaction to the film when I watched it then. And then as I grew up with the film and revisited it from time to time, up to now, where I am considerably older, I look at that film now and I think, my goodness, my feelings towards this film are so different from my feelings now versus my feelings towards the film when I was, however old I was, 20 years ago or maybe more. And so this is a kind of a surprising thing, and how this film has grown and evolved within me. As a film viewer of this is just astounding. And this is an example of how his works grow, and they turn into new things. They transform into different things based off of my own life and lived-in experience. A lot of the going back to Eyes Wide Shut, this film is about relationships in many respects. And it's about growing older and about our interactions. I mean, in particular, this particular character and their sort of interactions with different people, if you will. But it is about relationships. And I'm now older, and I find myself in a number of relationships that perhaps differed from my state of being when I was, however old I was, many, many years ago when I first saw the film. And so these help to inform my own interaction with the film all the more, and they make the experience of watching that particular film much more vivid and exciting and enthralling and disturbing as well, and which I think that's part of the point. And that's what I mean about the transformative effect of a work from Stanley Kubrick as one grows older and one revisits his films over time. The same is true for a film like The Shining. The Shining was a film that I kind of grew up with, or it was always around ever since I remember, because I was born in '79 and it came a little bit later, but it was always around. And I must admit, I never considered it to be a scary, scary film when I was growing up. I always thought that other horror films were a little bit scarier in terms of actual visceral thrill, if you know what I mean. But that's nothing against the film itself, because as you know, there are many other aspects of it besides its horror genre elements that I think take it to a wholly different level. But that's how I felt then. But now as I get older, I can see how utterly disturbing it is. And again, this is due to my own developments and my own life experiences. Having a family, getting into different relationships, etc., and how this film plays into the risks and the edginess and the real sense of dread in the family life. And I think that for me, watching it then versus watching it now, again, it's a wholly different transformative experience. And that's another example of how his works seem to transform and give certain edges and glints and beams of light that perhaps were cut off to me many years before, based off of my own age and my own certain level of experience at the time, many, many years ago versus now, perhaps. I don't know. Other things and my experiences with Stanley Kubrick's works, it's probably not such a big deal now, but the film Fear and Desire, which is a film that is somewhat unique. Perhaps some in the Stanley Kubrick filmography film fan community might consider it to be a little bit maybe notorious, perhaps. It is a very unique, interesting work, don't get me wrong, but I remember, and it's now fairly available now with the advent of Blu-ray and DVD and home media, which is wonderful. It's great to have more works. But I remember back when I was in college in the sort of 90s, and I remember that at the time, it was still impossible to watch Fear and Desire. But I was so lucky in that I was at my university, in my undergrad years, there was actually a 60 millimeter print of Fear and Desire, which was very, very rare at the time. At least that's what the film library custodian told me. But it was very, very rare at the time, and I was fortunate enough to be able to get it screened because it was a print that was in storage, but it had to be played on the reels in order to test it out. And I was in a position where I was trusted enough because I know how to project on a projector, and so 16 millimeter, mind you, and so I was able to project it on my own with the reels, and so that was a really wonderful thing. It was as a test, but I used the opportunity, of course, to watch the film, and it was really fascinating. Of course, there are certain aspects of the film in terms of its cinematic substance that I think are worth a discussion or maybe even debate, perhaps. But beyond those specific inherent discussions of the work itself, the very fact or the very idea of just being able to watch it during a time when it was really difficult or almost impossible to watch was real. That was a real thrill. That was one of the greatest moments in my own cinema journey growing up whenever I was a teenager or in my early 20s. So I remember that moment to this very day, and I will never forget it. So that was when I was able to watch Fear and Desire before it became more readily available with the advent of DVD and now Blu-ray. So there is that. I could go on and on, of course. I mean, I even to the little things. I love I love that thing. It's not Stanley Kubrick per se, but I love the thing, with the documentaries about Kubrick's works, and sometimes you get people like Steven Spielberg talking about his admiration for Stanley Kubrick's works. He has that famous thing about watch Paths of Glory, and I dare you to try to turn it off. You can't, or something like that. And I love how Steven Spielberg does this. He does this a lot. You notice that when he has interviews or with documentaries, he always does this when he's thinking or trying to give a comment in particular about Stanley Kubrick films, and so I always find that detail very interesting. There's a certain kind of effect that Stanley Kubrick has on many filmmakers even now. So I'd like to think that this is a kind of homage or ode to the master, perhaps. But there are, of course, other films that I haven't spoken about. Dr. Strangelove, of course. A Clockwork Orange, my goodness. Talk about a film that was that really impacted me, as I was able to watch that fairly young, and it was an unforgettable experience. But and then I was very happy also. I got the CD soundtracks of that. I got 2 versions of the CD soundtrack of that, and I still have that somewhere, and so I listen to that fairly regularly, of course. But that is a dark work. Talk about an emblematic Stanley Kubrick work, and A Clockwork Orange. And I haven't spoken about that film, but one of these days I'd love to be able to talk about A Clockwork Orange and other Kubrick works for that matter. Stanley Kubrick, right? Oh my goodness, what to say? Well. So this is Stanley Kubrick, and kind of and I didn't even mention, for instance, something like Full Metal Jacket, which is another film that has really grown on me, and it's now almost it's essential Stanley Kubrick viewing. Of course it is. And I didn't mention The Killing. Killer's Kiss also. That is another really interesting work. Again, I understand where it falls in the filmography, but it's just, there is so much depth to that. I'd love the opportunity to speak about that one of these days. Lolita, of course. Spartacus, too. Oh gosh, just so many to choose from, and not enough time in the day, perhaps. But that is, in a nutshell, how I feel about his works. And 2001, of course. What am I saying? I knew I was forgetting something. Didn't mean it, but it is so behemoth and is so gigantic, so much so that it was like the elephant in the room, perhaps. And it was so big that I missed it. Shame on me. 2001: A Space Odyssey. My goodness. Talk about a game changer. This is the game changer to end all game changers in cinema. This is, the game changer. All caps, underlined, highlighted, circle it. This is the one. if you're talking about cinema, if you want to have one, if you could only pick one example of a film, and I hate these sorts of questions, right? But if you could only pick one example of a film that really truly exemplifies the art, there are so many to choose from, of course, and depending on who you are, you can pick a different title. But I think one really worthy candidate as an answer to that question would be 2001: A Space Odyssey. Everything about that is marvelous, but you don't need me to say that, because you already know, we already know, it is just it is, in many ways, one can say 2001: A Space Odyssey is cinema, or cinema is 2001: A Space Odyssey. Every single thing about that film operates in terms of cinematic magic that goes beyond the frame into the otherworldly, into the scientific, but also into the sort of potential, if you will, of the art form itself. And it goes beyond so many things at once, but still remains constant. This is like cinema. And I think in many ways I've been so hesitant to speak about Kubrick's works, I think in large part because I respect them so much, and I know any comment that I might try to make about Kubrick's works would just fail. I would fail, but who knows? One of these days, perhaps, it would be my great pleasure to speak about Kubrick's works in more detail, and with the understanding, of course, that I would still be unable to comprehend the task fully because of my inability to be able to express myself well enough, and with my shallow intelligence, because his works demand so much. They really do. They demand so much. But maybe one of these days, if the winds of good fortune are kind to me, then perhaps I might try to talk a little bit more about Stanley Kubrick's works, or at least how they have affected me in my own personal journey with more specificity vis-a-vis the works themselves. But that's just a general overview right now of my real feeling and admiration for his films. I adore his works very much. I really do. I adore his works. And I'm not going to say it, but from the very beginning to the very end, his career is vast. It's, of course, in many ways, it's a very limited filmography when compared to the filmographies of other filmmakers, of course, but it is very selected. It's very purposeful. It is very focused. And I love when you consider the films early on in his filmography to the films at the very end. And I love how, I'm not going to say it, I'm not going to say anything more because I don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen the film, but Eyes Wide Shut. That is a film that is very tough. It is very cruel. It can be very cold. But that's the point, because it also has a certain degree of warmth. It has a certain level of human connectedness. And it's expressed in such a truly epic Stanley Kubrick way. You think about that film and how that film ends, and how that film ends, the final shot and the final word that ends the film, and thus the entire filmography of Stanley Kubrick. It is so fitting. What a brilliant way to cap off a already brilliant filmography. That everything about that film, but especially the end and that final moment before it goes black. And then the credits roll, and that final word. Oh my goodness! But I'm not going to say anything more, my friends, because I don't want to spoil it. It is worth talking about in great detail. So maybe one of these days, maybe, I hope it's very soon, I can talk about the works of Stanley Kubrick here on this channel, with the understanding, of course, that anything that I would even hope to try to say would just fail, because his works are that mammoth. But it might be worth considering. But anyway, I'm so sorry to keep on like this, and I hope you can forgive me. But I'm always very excited when I here about Stanley Kubrick, but there has been a certain reason why I've maybe hesitated perhaps, or not necessarily spoken about his works as much as, say, other people, other film fans, etc. And that's simply because I really respect them and I really admire them so much. But I know that they require a certain degree or certain level of approach. And I really need to be in the proper mindset before I'm able to fully immerse myself in them, at least in the context of this YouTube channel. But just in a nutshell, that's my feeling and take on the world of Stanley Kubrick. So I really admire his works very much. But anyway, thank you so much for your great questions. You've really given me a lovely opportunity here to speak more about my own cinematic journey. So thank you. And let me just end it there. So thank you so much again. And until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much, my friends, as always, and cheers.